So once again, let's review what we have implemented so far. When we refresh the page, our to-do items fade in. One more time. Look, they're fading in. Now, what if at the same time, I also want to animate this to-do's heading? Perhaps we want it to slide down from the top of the screen. So let's see how we can implement this. Back to our template, just like how we applied this trigger to do animation on this button, we can create another trigger and apply it on this heading. But that approach is a little bit messy because with each trigger, we need to define this transition, enter. Also, chances are, in a more complex markup, we're going to have different kinds of elements here, maybe a paragraph, maybe an image. We don't want to create a separate trigger for each of these. If all these elements are logically part of one thing, which is basically one component, it would be better to create a trigger and apply that trigger to that component, to that parent as a whole. And then we can animate its children independently. So let me show you how to implement this. Let's put all this markup inside a parent div. So I'm going to select all this, cut, div, this is our container, and then paste everything here. Now on this div, which is our parent or the container, I want to apply a trigger like to-dos animation. So this is for the to-dos component as a whole, or to-dos page. Now let's go back to our component. Here in the animations property, I'm going to define a new trigger called to-dos animation. And this is the implementation. Now in this trigger, we should have one or more transitions. So at a minimum, we should have the enter transition. Now when this component enters the view, I want to animate the heading as well as the to-do items separately. So how do we get the heading? For that, we need to use one of the helper functions called query. So query. This function is also defined in Angular/animations module. Now look at the first parameter of this function. It's a string and it's a selector. So here we can use CSS selectors. For example, if I want to get an H1 element, I can add that here. Or I can get an element with a particular class or with a particular ID, just the typical selectors we use in CSS. But we also have a bunch of pseudo selectors tokens. So we have enter and leave. When a child element enters or leaves this container, we have animating. When a child element is animating, we can also query elements by an animation trigger applied on them. Or if you want to get all elements that have an animation trigger, use an asterisk. And finally, if you want to reference the same element, which is the container, we can use the self token. Now, you don't need to memorize these. You can always come back to the documentation. And by the way, you don't necessarily need to use all of these every time you use animations. Just remember that these are there. And if you need them, you can come back and read more about them. So let's see a few of these in action. Back here, I want to get our H1. So we get our heading. Now, look at the second parameter of this function. It's an animation metadata or animation metadata array. By dropping these words, animation and metadata, in theory, we can pass anything here. But in practice, that's not going to work because once again, there's a design problem in the animations module in Angular. But that aside, what we pass here as the second argument is the steps that should run when animating this H1 when it enters the view. So it can be one step or multiple steps. I'm going to go with multiple steps. So first, I'm going to apply a style. Use transform to push it a few pixels to the top. So translate Y. Let's move it 20 pixels up. And then animate it over 1 second. So over 1 second, it's going to slide down. Now let's test the application. Back in the browser. Refresh. So our heading is sliding from the top. One more time. Look, beautiful. However, our to-do items no longer have an animation. Let's refresh the page one more time. See, our to-do items have absolutely no animation. But here I expect to see a fade-in animation. Now here's the interesting part. If I add a new item here, this item is going to have an animation. See the fade-in effect? So it didn't work the first time we loaded the page, but when we add a new item, that item will have an animation. In the next lecture, I will show you how to fix this problem.